Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Bush arrived in South Korea last night on the first leg of a trip to Asia that'll also take him to Thailand and to China, where he'll attend the opening ceremony of the Beijing Summer Olympics on Friday. In China, Bush will meet President Hu Jintao and other Chinese leaders. His visit to China will be the fourth of his presidency. No other U.S. president has visited China more than once. Bush has been criticized by a number of lawmakers and human rights groups for his decision to attend the Beijing Games. He's rebuffed calls to boycott the opening ceremonies over a number of Chinese policies, such as repression of Tibetan independence movement, its support for the Sudanese government in Darfur, and its crackdown on dissidents and civil liberties at home. In an interview with the Washington Post, Bush said, quote, "One of the reasons I'm going is because I want to show respect to the Chinese people, and this is a proud moment for China." Well, in the latest issue of Harper's magazine, Ken Silverstein says many of the bipartisan experts who've advocated so-called constructive engagement with China are tied to major U.S. multinational corporations that profit heavily from the Chinese market. Ken Silverstein joins me now from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Ken.
Thanks.
Lay out your thesis and the mandarins, the title of your piece.
Well, basically, I started looking at the campaign advisors, actually, to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. This was a few months ago when I started, and she was still very much part of the fight for the Democratic nomination, and John McCain. And I didn't have the story ended up being a little bit different than what I had initially imagined, but what I discovered was that many of these advisors, not just advisors on China policy, in fact, although that's what I focused on, but many of the presidential advisors to the top candidates worked for some of these international consulting firms whose whole business model is to open up doors abroad for U.S. and other Western companies, in fact. So, for example, in the case of China, you have a guy named Jeffrey Bader, who is at the Brookings Institution, which I think maybe we can get back to in a minute, but who also has worked for Stonebridge International, which is a big consulting firm headed by Sandy Berger, who used to be with the Clinton administration, and in fact who was primarily responsible for, or not one of the people primarily responsible for the big opening with China under Clinton. Remember, Clinton came into office promising that he would honor the spirit of Tiananmen Square and left having put into place permanent normal trade relations with Beijing. But you found time and time again that the key advisors to the major presidential candidates had these economic conflicts that were never stated when they wrote op-eds or were interviewed on TV or radio. They were always, or typically they'd be identified as belonging to a think tank or simply as a former government official. Well, what about their relationship with, say, Stonebridge, where not only Jeffrey Bader, Obama's a big advisor for Obama, but Ken Lieberthal, who was the senior advisor to Clinton on China policy, both of them hold positions there. Now, it's fine if they want to, acknowledge where they work and let the listener or the viewer decide if this might influence their point of view. But to put people on TV or on the radio and to simply let them appear to be an independent observer, when in fact they have a direct stake, really, in a close relationship between Washington and Beijing, and when their business model actually requires them being on reasonably good terms with Chinese government officials, and in fact, generally much better than reasonably good terms, generally very warm, positive terms with Chinese officials, because they're door openers. You cannot open doors with Chinese government officials on behalf of Western companies unless you are on good terms. I mean, if they don't like you, if you say a lot of nasty things about Tibet or human rights or anything else, then the Chinese government officials that you need to help you in your business are not going to be there for you. So it's an inherent conflict that's just very, very rarely discussed.
The company that's Sandy Berger, chief advisor to President Clinton, also perhaps the foremost architect of the administration's dramatic shift in China policy. You point out that before he came into the Clinton administration, was with the law firm of Hogan and Hartson, and he coordinated business lobbying for China at that law firm.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people I'm talking about, most of these advisors previously worked in government. Now they may be off in the business, the private sector. Some of them are going to end up going back into government. I'm quite sure of that in either Obama or McCain administration. But yeah, Berger's a classic example. I mean, he started off in the private sector, lobbying for permanent normal trade relations for China. This was back in the 90s. And this, I think probably many of your listeners may have forgotten, but 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the U.S. relationship with Beijing was extremely heated. I mean, the debate about permanent normal trade relations with China was almost as heated as the debate over NAFTA. Millions and millions and millions of dollars was spent by the business community to lobby for this policy. And the Clinton administration reversed itself. Completely reversed itself and decided that it would prioritize over human rights policy. It would prioritize commercial relationships, and that's what happened. And Berger was one of the architects of this policy. After he left Hogan and Hartson, he joined the Clinton administration. So he basically lobbies for China in the private sector, joins the Clinton administration where he lobbies for China, then goes to Stonebridge International where he's basically lobbying for China still. And you find this pattern time and time again. There are senior government officials who, had previously worked on behalf of China in one form or another. They go into government, then they retire, and they still have very, very important ties to China that benefit them financially in a very direct, personal manner.
Can you talk, Ken Silverstein, about Alexander Haig and about Brent Scowcroft? Talk about first Haig.
Well, Haig is, the Chinese love Haig. I mean, there's probably no American who they are more fond of than Al Haig. He worked with President Nixon and helped arrange the historic visit that Nixon made to China, which marked the opening. He worked with, he was Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and he very actively promoted Chinese interest against Taiwan, which also had a very powerful lobby. And I should say here that, Haig and many of the generation of foreign policy advisors from those years, the Reagan years and the Nixon years, the Republican presidents, pre-George Bush, looked upon simply, or the Cold War Republican presidents, looked upon China simply as a buffer against the Soviet Union or as an ally against the Soviet Union. They didn't really look at China in any way other than as a geopolitical, geostrategic vehicle for the United States. And, our primary enemy was the Soviet Union. And even though China was communist, it was not close at all to the Soviet Union. And so we made an alliance with China, in this grand strategic game. So Haig develops very close relationships with China then. Then he retires after becoming somewhat controversial. Some of your listeners may recall when he tried to take over the U.S. government after Ronald Reagan was shot, claiming that he was next in line for power. He made a number of blunders. Yet he then goes into the private sector, opens up a firm called Worldwide Consulting, and from there becomes a door opener. And he does a lot of business in China, very close to the Chinese government. He actually went to Tiananmen, on a year after Tiananmen Square, he went to Beijing and stood in Tiananmen Square during the 40th anniversary of the Communist Party's rise to power in China. He was the only prominent Westerner who attended. Most of the Western ambassadors boycott, but Haig, in a show of solidarity, turns up at Tiananmen. And so, of course, the Chinese government loves Al Haig. So if you're a company, an American company, and you want to establish a business in China or expand your business in China, of course you're going to go to a guy like Al Haig. He can help you. So you pay Haig, and he opens the doors for you in China. Same thing with Scowcroft. Scowcroft also worked for the Bush administration at the time of Tiananmen, and very soon after the crackdown there, traveled to Beijing and met secretly with Chinese leaders to try to make sure that there would be no serious fallout in the U.S.-China relationship. So he is also well-loved by the Chinese government. And these are the sorts of people who American companies now can turn to and say, look, we need your help. And they get it because the Chinese government is very fond of these former officials.
You give the example of Brent Scowcroft taking the former CEO of Qualcomm, Irwin Jacobs, for a meeting with China's prime minister.
Yeah, he traveled over to China with several prominent Fortune 500 CEOs, including the CEO of Qualcomm and also of Chubb Corporation, as I recall. And, you know, this is what we know, because the fact is that these companies do not disclose their clients. It's very difficult to find out who they're actually working for. They're under no – it's actually in some ways more nefarious than lobbying, I think, because if you're a registered lobbyist, then at least the American public knows who you represent. And if you go on TV, people can at least say, oh, he's a former – he was a lobbyist for such and such government or such and such corporation. But the people at these big economic consulting firms like Stonebridge, or Scowcroft has his own